Salvete Legionaries. Today we have a fun episode in store for us as we are going to examine the structure of a Roman legion. The Roman legion was the fighting force of ancient Rome, and it was the most organized and efficient fighting force of its day. So here on the screen we can see a diagram of the legion. This was taken from my old Latin textbook, which I used in high school. We have the senior commanders at the top. Then in this blue box, we have the first cohort. And then another blue box, we have the 2nd through 10th cohorts. So we will examine the first cohort and then the 2nd and 10th cohorts and what makes them different a bit later. But to start out, I want to begin by looking at the smallest unit within a Roman legion, which was the century. After we understand what a century is, we will then examine a cohort, followed by a glimpse at the officers, which are up here on the top of the screen. So, if we go to the very first slide of this presentation, the century. The century was the smallest organized unit within a legion. Today, when we hear the word century, we think of the number 100. However, a typical century in a Roman legion usually consisted of around 80 men. So a lot of people have this misconception that a Roman century was actually 100 men, but due to logistical reasons and trouble recruiting, it was hard to keep 100 men staff all the time. So a typical Roman century just had around 80 men. The first cohort was different, as we'll talk about in a bit, but for the rest of the cohorts in a Roman legion, 80 men was the standard amount of legionnaires in a century. So, every century was led by 2 officers, a centurion and an optio, and we will talk about these 2 roles more on the next slide. So at the bottom of the screen, you can see a picture from the diagram of the centurion and the optio, and then on the right is a nice little artwork of a centurion examining his legionnaires. So if we go on to the next slide, the centurion commanded the century and was an experienced soldier who had risen the ranks due to his courage and ability. He was responsible for the discipline and training of the century. As a symbol of rank, he carried a vetus, which was a cane he used to punish soldiers. The optio, meanwhile, was his deputy and would assume command if the centurion fell in battle. So if we go on to the next slide. A Roman legion was made up of 10 cohorts. Cohorts 2 through 10 were uniformly structured and consisted of 6 centuries each. Each cohort also had a designated tesserarius, signifer, cornicon. The tesserarius organized sentries and managed the camp's passwords, so he was basically the guy in charge of security in a camp. The signifer was the standard bearer, and he also managed the finances of the cohort. And the cornicon was the cohort's horn player, who played the horn as they went to battle and also summoned legionaries for a roll call. So here at the bottom of the screen, we can see that the 2nd through 10th cohorts within a legion all had 6 centuries each, and each of these centuries had about 80 men. So each cohort had 1 tesserarius, 1 signifer, and 1 cornicon, and as we can see, the 2nd through 10th cohorts had 6 centurions and 6 optios per cohort. And if we go on to the next slide, we'll see that the first cohort was structured differently from the other ones. This is because the first cohort was the most prestigious and elite troops within a legion, and unlike the other cohorts, it was comprised of 5 double-sized centuries of about 160 men. The 5 centurions of the first cohort were called the primi ordines, which was the first rank, and the most senior of these centurions was the centurio primus pilus. So the first cohort, because it is the elite troops within a legion, it was structured differently from the others. It only had 5 centuries, but these centuries were double-sized. So like I said, a normal century had about 80 men, so these would have 160. The first cohort still had 1 tesserarius, 1 signifer, and 1 cornicon, but its centurions stood out from the other centurions within a legion, as they were designated as the primi ordines, and the best of these centurions was given the special designation of primus pilus. Primus pilus just means first spear, and his word was often highly valued by the legatus of a legion and by the other senior officers. So if we go on to the next slide, let's examine some of these senior officers. The leadership positions in a Roman legion included the following roles: the legatus, the praefect castrorum, the tribuni, and the aquilifer. So let's begin with the praefectus castrorum. Within a legion, the commander of a camp was known as a praefectus castrorum. He was typically in his 50s and was a centurion who served in the legion for his entire career. Oftentimes, the centurio primus pilus of the first cohort would be promoted to praefectus castrorum upon the death or retirement of the former camp commander. So whenever the Roman legion was on the march and they would set up their camp for the night, this was the guy officially in charge of the camp. He had authority over all of the other centurions and the tesserarius, the signifers of all the different cohorts, but he was not the general of the legion. Instead, that role would be filled by what was called a legatus. So, as we can see on this next slide, the officer in charge of commanding the legion was called a legatus. He was a member of the Roman Senate and usually was in his 30s. Unlike career centurions, the legatus usually commanded his legion for 3 to 4 years before resuming his career in the Senate. So, the legatus was the man officially in charge of the legion. Here on the right, you can see another nice little artwork of a legatus commanding his first cohort here. And one thing that it really should be emphasized here is that the legatus was not a career military man. Unlike the primus pilus or the praefectus castrorum, he usually served only 3 to 4 years as legatus of the legion before returning to the Roman Senate for a political career. So if we go on to the next slide, the legatus was assisted by 6 military tribunes, which were called tribuni in Latin. One of these was called the tribunus laticlavius, or senior tribune with a broad stripe. Ignore that typo, it should be tribunus, not tribuni, because he's singular. The tribunus laticlavius was a young man of noble birth who served a military apprenticeship under the legatus before entering politics. So again, here at the bottom of the screen, we can see the 6 different tribunes. One of them was born into a more noble family than the others, and was given the special broad stripe to designate him, and that was the tribunus laticlavius. He was more respected than the other tribuni, even though they were all officers within a legion. The other tribunes were labeled the tribuni angustaclavi, and that meant that they had a narrow stripe instead of a broad stripe on their uniforms. So if we go on to the next slide, I already said that. They were members of a slightly lower social caste than the tribunus laticlavius, but were still relatively wealthy, educated young men. After their military service, they would seek important posts within the imperial administration. So the main difference we can know is that since the tribunus laticlavius came from a more noble family, he would usually have intentions of becoming a senator himself, whereas the tribuni angustaclavi joined the legion to try to get an important post within Roman administration, but probably not senator. So if we go on to the next slide, we'll look at the role of the aquilifer. The signifer of the first cohort was given the special honor of being the legion's aquilifer, who carried the eagle standard of Rome, which was called an aquila. The aquilifer was easily recognizable as he usually wore the pelt of a lion, a wolf, a boar, or a bull over his head. The aquila was a highly revered possession for a legion. Its loss was considered a great disgrace, and I left this out, but whenever a Roman legion set up camp, the aquila would be kept in a special tent in the center of the camp. That's how important it was for the Roman legion. So if we go on to the next slide. So not everybody within a Roman legion was a legionary soldier or an officer. Roman legions were also bolstered by auxiliary troops and specialists, such as cavalry and archers. They often came from distant parts of the empire. They were paid less than legionaries, but could earn Roman citizenship in exchange for service to a legion. The legion also brought with it many slaves and animals to perform grunt work and haul equipment. So the most common auxiliary troops that a Roman legion would bring with them on their campaigns were cavalrymen and archers. These cavalrymen and archers could come from Rome or the Italian provinces, but normally they didn't, and they were specialized in a certain military role. Unlike a normal legionary who would carry his pilus, which was a spear, a gladius, which was a sword, and a scutum, which was his shield, these men would carry whatever was pertinent to what they were specialized in. So obviously an archer would carry a bow and arrow instead. And then you also had a lot of slaves accompanying a legion on their campaign. The slaves didn't fight, obviously, but they would do the grunt work, haul equipment, and really just do whatever the legion needed them to do. They wouldn't be paid, but the auxiliary soldiers in a legion would. So I think that wraps up the presentation. If we go on to the next slide, we have a vocabulary summary and then another diagram of the legion. So during this presentation, we talked about the Roman century, a centurion, an optio, a vetus, which was the cane used by a centurion to punish legionnaires, the cohort, the tesserarius, the signifer, the cornican, the primi ordinis, the primus pilus, the legatus, the praefectus castrorum, the tribunus laticlavius, the tribuni angusticlavi, the aquilifer, and the aquila. And putting them all together in a diagram of the legion, which I showed on the first slide, but we'll go over it again. Here on the right side at the very top was the legatus, who was the equivalent of the general of the legion, and to his left is the praefectus castrorum, who was in charge of the camp and second only to the legatus. The legatus was aided by the tribunus laticlavius, and then the other tribuni, which were called the tribuni angusticlavi. And then you also had the aquilifer, which was a coveted position. Normally it was the signifer of the first cohort, and he would carry the aquila into battle. The first cohort was comprised of 5 double-sized centuries, each containing about 160 men, and the first cohort had a tesserarius, a signifer, which was normally also the aquilifer, and then the cornican. The 2nd through 10th cohorts were less prestigious than the first. They had a tesserarius, just a normal signifer who wasn't the aquilifer, a cornican, and then they had 6 centuries each instead of 5, and these centuries only contained around 80 men. And then if we look right under that, a Roman legion also contained about 120 auxiliary horsemen. So that concludes our study of the structure of a Roman legion. I really had fun making this, frankly, because it's just fun to talk about ancient Rome and their military. So I hope you all enjoyed, and I will see you all next time.